There's a pattern that has torn apart three of the most powerful nations in modern history, and it has nothing to do with foreign invasion, nothing to do with military defeat, nothing to do with running out of money. It's something far more dangerous. It's what happens when a nation turns against itself. In 1900, Britain controlled the largest empire in human history, 25% of the world's land surface, 400 million subjects. The pound sterling dominated global trade. Within 50 years, the empire was gone. Not conquered. Fragmented from within. In 1980, the Soviet Union was a nuclear superpower. 290 million people. 100 distinct nationalities. An arsenal of tens of thousands of nuclear weapons. By 1991, it ceased to exist. Not defeated in battle. Torn apart by internal divisions that Moscow couldn't control. In 1800, Qing China ruled the most populous nation on earth. 300 million people. A 4,000-year legacy of civilization. By 1912, the dynasty collapsed. Not from Western invasion alone, from internal rebellions that killed 30 million people and shattered the empire from the inside. 3 times, 3 great powers. 3 complete collapses, all following the exact same sequence of internal fracturing. And here's what should disturb you. The United States is now deep into that sequence. We're not approaching the pattern, we're living inside it, stage by stage, fracture by fracture. This is the story of how nations tear themselves apart. Why they never see it coming, and why every indicator suggests America is next. And it's happening faster than anyone in Washington wants to admit. Before we walk through the pattern, you need to understand what internal collapse actually looks like. Not in history books. In reality, what it means when a great power destroys itself from within. Internal collapse doesn't begin with external enemies. It begins with internal enemies. It starts when the people who are supposed to be on the same team start viewing each other as the real threat. When elites split into warring factions, when regions pull against the center, when citizens lose any sense of shared identity or common purpose. At first, the fractures are invisible. The government still functions, the military still operates, the economy still runs, but beneath the surface, the bonds that hold the nation together are dissolving. Trust erodes. Institutions become battlegrounds. Every decision becomes a zero-sum war between factions who would rather see the system burn than let their opponents win. Then comes the acceleration. Governance becomes paralyzed. Nothing can be built. Nothing can be reformed. Nothing can be agreed upon. The center cannot hold because no one wants it to hold. Everyone is pulling in different directions, and the nation begins to tear at the seams. Regional identities strengthen as national identity weakens. Provinces start acting like independent states. Ethnic groups demand autonomy. Ideological tribes become more real than citizenship. And suddenly the nation that looked invincible from outside is hollow on the inside. That's not theoretical. That's what happened to Britain, Russia, and China. And it happened because they followed the exact same 6-stage sequence we're following now. They believed their divisions were manageable. They believed their institutions would hold. They believed they were exceptional. They were wrong every single time. Let's look at how it actually happened. 3 times the exact same way. Before we examine each empire, you need to understand the 6 stages of internal collapse. This is the sequence that repeats across centuries, across cultures, across political systems. Stage 1 is unified ascent. The nation rises through shared purpose, a common enemy, a unifying ideology, a collective mission that bonds the population together. Differences exist, but they're subordinated to national goals. The center is strong. The periphery is loyal. Stage 2 is elite fracturing. The ruling class splits into competing factions. Instead of governing together, elites begin fighting each other for control. Political parties become tribal enemies. Institutions become weapons. Compromise becomes betrayal. Stage 3 is regional fragmentation. As the center weakens, the periphery strengthens. Provinces, states, and territories start prioritizing local interests over national cohesion. Regional identities harden. The nation becomes a collection of competing parts rather than a unified whole. Stage 4 is institutional paralysis. Government becomes gridlocked. Nothing can be built because nothing can be agreed upon. Courts are politicized. Legislatures are deadlocked. Executive power is either impotent or authoritarian. The system designed to solve problems becomes the problem. Stage 5 is legitimacy collapse. Citizens stop believing in the system. Trust in institutions evaporates. People withdraw loyalty from the nation and transfer it to their faction, their region, their tribe. The social contract dissolves. Stage 6 is dissolution or revolution. The nation either fragments into pieces, collapses into authoritarian control, or is swept away by revolution. The great power becomes a cautionary tale. The empire becomes a memory. That's the pattern. 6 stages, 3 imperies, same sequence, every time. Now let's see how it played out in practice. Let's start with the largest empire in human history, Britain. At its peak in 1920, The British Empire covered 13.7 million square miles. The sun literally never set on British territory because they controlled land on every continent. London was the financial capital of the world. The Royal Navy ruled the seas. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency, and the British believed it would last forever. They called it the empire on which the sun never sets, as if geography made them immune to history. Within 50 years, the empire was gone, every colony gone, every territory either independent or transferred. Britain went from ruling 400 million people to being a medium-sized island nation asking permission to join the European Economic Community. What happened? The empire didn't fall to foreign conquest. It fragmented from internal divisions that London couldn't manage. Britain's rise was built on shared purpose. The Industrial Revolution, the defeat of Napoleon, the expansion of trade, the civilizing mission that united British society across class lines. He, she, and, poor English and Scottish, Protestant and even eventually Catholic, all bound together by the project of empire. The divisions existed, class conflict was real, Irish resentment was deep, but the imperial project papered over these fractures. As long as Britain was expanding, as long as wealth was flowing, as long as the mission was clear, the nation held together. That shared purpose began to fracture in the early 20th century. The British ruling class split into irreconcilable factions: conservatives versus liberals, imperialists versus reformers, protectionists versus free traders, the aristocracy versus the rising industrial class. By 1900, British politics had become a battlefield. The House of Lords blocked reform. The House of Commons pushed back. The People's Budget of 1909 triggered a constitutional crisis that nearly paralyzed the government. Ireland became the breaking point. The Home Rule debate divided Britain's elite so completely that by 1914, British army officers were threatening mutiny rather than enforce Irish policy. British soldiers refusing to follow orders from the British government. That's how deep the fractures ran. World War I temporarily unified the nation against an external enemy. But the war accelerated every internal division. Class tensions exploded. Labor unions gained power. The aristocratic order that had governed Britain for centuries began to crumble. By 1926, Britain experienced a general strike. Workers versus owners. Class warfare in the streets of London. The elite consensus that had built the empire was shattered. Check. As the center fractured, the periphery pulled away. Ireland was first, the Easter Rising of 1916, the War of Independence from 1919 to 1921. By 1922, Ireland was partitioned, the southern 26 counties effectively independent. Britain's first major territorial loss in centuries, and it came from internal rebellion, not foreign conquests. But Ireland was just the beginning. India, the crown jewel of the empire, began demanding independence. Gandhi's movement wasn't just a political campaign, it was a fundamental rejection of British legitimacy. 300 million Indians deciding they no longer accepted British rule. The same pattern repeated across Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia. Colonial populations that had tolerated British rule began demanding so. Not because Britain had been defeated militarily, because the internal divisions in London made it impossible to maintain control. British leaders couldn't agree on how to respond, reform or repress, grant autonomy or tighten control. Every decision was paralyzed by factional fighting in Westminster. The empire began fragmenting before Britain even realized it was happening. Check World War II exposed the full extent of British institutional decay. Britain technically won the war, but victory came at the cost of bankruptcy. By 1945, Britain owed more than its entire GDP. The treasury was empty, the military was exhausted, the institutions that had governed the empire for centuries were broken, and yet, even in crisis, the government couldn't function. Labor versus conservative, nationalization versus privatization, austerity versus spending. Every decision became a political war. Clement Attlee's government tried to reform Britain while simultaneously managing imperial collapse. It was impossible. The bandwidth wasn't there. The consensus wasn't there. India gained independence in 1947. Pakistan was partitioned. Hundreds of thousands died in the chaos of Britain's withdrawal. Not because Britain planned it poorly, because Britain's paralyzed institutions couldn't plan anything at all. One by one, the colonies fell away. Burma, Ceylon, Malaya, Kenya, Ghana, Nigeria. Each departure was chaotic, rushed, often violent. Britain wasn't granted independence. Britain was losing control and calling it policy. Checked by the 1950s. The British population had stopped believing in the empire. The Suez Crisis of 1956 was the final humiliation. Britain invaded Egypt to seize the Suez Canal. The United States ordered Britain to withdraw. Britain obeyed. The empire that had ruled the waves for 300 years was now taking orders from Washington. The population watched their nation, humiliated on the world stage. Whatever pride remained in the imperial project evaporated overnight. From that point forward, empire was an embarrassment. British identity had to be rebuilt from scratch without the colonies, without the global mission, without the certainty that had defined British life for generations. Trust in British institutions collapsed. The class system seemed absurd. The aristocracy seemed obsolete. The old order had failed, and everyone knew it. Check. The British Empire dissolved between 1947 and 1970. India went first, then the African colonies, then the Caribbean, then the Pacific territories. By 1970, Britain retained only scattered islands in Gibraltar. The empire that had taken 300 years to build disappeared in 25 years, not conquered, fragmented, torn apart by internal divisions that made governance impossible and unity unthinkable. Britain today is a G7 nation, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, a nuclear power, but it's a shadow of what it was. The sun now sets on British territory every single day. That's complete dissolution, and Britain followed the pattern exactly. Now let's jump forward to the most dramatic collapse in modern history, the Soviet Union. On January 1st, 1991, the USSR was one of two superpowers on Earth. It covered 1/6 of the world's land surface, 22.4 million square kilometers, 290 million people, 100 distinct nationalities, tens of thousands of nuclear weapons. The Red Army was the largest military force in Europe. By December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union no longer existed. Not defeated in war, not invaded, not conquered. From internal divisions that Moscow couldn't control, 361 days from superpower to historical artifact, here's how it happened. Stage by stage, the Soviet Union was built on ideology. Communism wasn't just an economic system, it was a religion, a mission, a shared purpose that bound 100 nationalities together under one red flag. The Great Patriotic War against Nazi Germany cemented Soviet identity. 27 million Soviet citizens died defeating fascism. That shared sacrifice, that collective trauma, created bonds that transcended ethnic and regional differences. For decades, Soviet identity held Ukrainians and Russians, Georgians and Kazakhs, Lithuanians and Uzbeks, all united by communist ideology and victory over Hitler. The divisions existed. Ethnic tensions simmered. Regional resentments festered. But the Soviet system suppressed them, channeled them, controlled them, until it couldn't. By the 1980s, the Soviet elite had fractured into irreconcilable camps. Reformers like Mikhail Gorbachev believed the system needed radical change, glasnost, perestroika, openness, and restructuring. Hardliners believed reform was betrayal, that loosening control would destroy everything the party had built. The Communist Party, which had ruled with iron discipline for 70 years, split into factions that hated each other more than they hated the West. Gorbachev's advisor, Edward Shevardnadze, told him in 1984, "Everything is rotten. It has to be changed." But changing it meant releasing forces no one could control. When Gorbachev instituted glasnost, he intended to foster dialogue. Instead, he opened the floodgates to criticism of the entire Soviet system. Every suppressed grievance, every hidden resentment, every ethnic tension exploded into public view. The Soviet elite couldn't agree on how to respond. Reform more, crack down. The paralysis was total. Check. As Moscow fractured, the republics pulled away. The Baltic states moved first. Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. They had never accepted Soviet rule. They had been independent nations before World War II, annexed by Stalin, occupied by force. When Moscow's grip loosened, they sprinted toward independence. In 1989, 2 million people joined hands across all three Baltic states in a human chain demanding freedom. 600 kilometers of people linked together, rejecting Moscow. But the Baltics were just the beginning. Ukraine, the second largest republic, began asserting independence. The Ukrainian parliament declared sovereignty. In July 1990, not independence yet, sovereignty. The distinction mattered legally, but everyone understood where it was heading. Georgia erupted. Armenia and Azerbaijan went to war over Nagorno. Ethnic violence exploded in Uzbekistan, in Kazakhstan, in Moldova. The 100 nationalities that Stalin had forced together were ripping themselves apart. Moscow tried to hold the center. It couldn't. The military was demoralized by Afghanistan. The economy was collapsing. The party was paralyzed by factional warfare. By 1990, the Soviet Union was a union in name only. Czech Soviet institutions, designed for absolute control, couldn't function under reform. Gorbachev tried to democratize a system built for dictatorship. The result was chaos. The Communist Party lost its monopoly in power, but retained its bureaucratic strength. Economic reforms introduced market mechanisms, but left price controls in place. The result was the worst of both systems. Inflation exploded, shortages multiplied. The black market became larger than the official economy. Stores were empty while warehouses were full because no one knew who had authority to distribute goods. The government literally could not govern. The Supreme Soviet debated while the republics declared independence. The Communist Party held congresses while ethnic violence killed hundreds. Moscow issued decrees that no one obeyed. By 1991, the paralysis was so complete that hardliners attempted a coup to restore order. They failed within 3 days. Not because the reformers defeated them, because the coup plotters couldn't even organize a coup. The institutions they relied on no longer functioned. That's total institutional paralysis check. The Soviet population stopped believing in the system long before it collapsed. Chernobyl in 1986 was the turning point. The nuclear disaster was bad enough. The government cover-up was worse. Moscow lied about radiation levels while citizens were dying. Mayday parades proceeded while fallout contaminated children. Gorbachev himself later said, Even more than my launch of perestroika, Chernobyl was perhaps the real cause of the collapse of the Soviet Union 5 years later. Whatever trust remained in Soviet institutions evaporated. The party had lied about economics, lied about history, lied about Afghanistan, and now they were lying about nuclear radiation poisoning their own people. Citizens withdrew their loyalty. They stopped believing in communism, stopped believing in the Union, stopped believing in anything Moscow said. By 1991, when Yeltsin stood on a tank to oppose the coup, he represented something new, Russian identity, separate from Soviet identity. The people of Moscow didn't defend the Soviet Union. They defended Russia. The legitimacy of the Union was gone. Only force could hold it together, and no one was willing to use force anymore. Check. On December 8, 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met in a hunting lodge near Minsk. They signed the Belavisa Accords, declaring that the Soviet Union had ceased to exist. No referendum, no vote, no consultation with the other 12 republics. 3 men in a forest ended a 70-year superpower. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned as president of a country that no longer existed. On December 26th, the Soviet flag came down over the Kremlin for the last time. 361 days from superpower to the internal divisions, the elite fracturing, the regional fragmentation, the institutional paralysis, the legitimacy collapse, all of it culminated in the fastest disintegration of a major power in modern history. The Soviet Union followed the pattern exactly. Now let's go back further to the collapse that shaped modern Asia, Qing Dynasty China. In 1800, Qing China was the most populous nation on earth. 300 million people. A civilization stretching back 4,000 years. An empire that considered itself the center of the world, the Middle Kingdom, surrounded by barbarians. The Qing emperor ruled with the mandate of heaven, absolute authority sanctioned by cosmic order. By 1912, the dynasty was gone. The last emperor was a child. The empire had shattered into warlord territories that wouldn't reunify for decades. What happened? Foreign pressure was real. The Opium Wars humiliated China. Western powers carved out treaty ports and spheres of influence. But foreign pressure alone didn't destroy the Qing. Internal divisions did. The Qing dynasty was founded by Manchu conquerors in 1644. They weren't Han Chinese. They were northern invaders who defeated the Ming dynasty and imposed their rule on 300 million Han subjects. For 200 years, the Qing maintained unity through a careful balance. Manchu military dominance combined with Han bureaucratic tradition. The examination system gave talented Han Chinese a path to power. Confucian ideology provided shared values across ethnic lines. It worked. The Qing expanded China's territory to its greatest extent. They conquered Tibet, Xinjiang, Mongolia, Taiwan. The empire prospered through the 1700s. But the balance was always fragile. The Manchu were a tiny minority ruling a vast Han majority. Unity depended on continued Qing legitimacy. When that legitimacy cracked, everything fell apart. By the mid-1800s, the Qing elite had split into irreconcilable factions. Conservatives wanted to preserve traditional order. Reformers wanted to adopt Western technology and methods. Manchu aristocrats wanted to protect their privileges. Han officials wanted greater power. The court became a battleground. Empress Dowager Cixi dominated politics for decades, playing factions against each other, blocking reforms that threatened her power. When reformers briefly gained control in 1898, launching the 100 Days Reform, Cixi staged a coup within 3 months. The reform emperor was imprisoned. Reform leaders were executed. The message was clear. Change was treason. But the factional warfare continued. Regional governors accumulated power as the center weakened. Ethnic Manchu and ethnic Han officials viewed each other with suspicion. The bureaucracy, once the pride of Chinese civilization, became corrupt and paralyzed. No one could agree on how to save the dynasty. Every proposal was blocked by an opposing faction. Every reform was sabotaged by those who benefited from the status quo. Check. As Beijing fractured, the provinces pulled away. China was too large to govern from one center, especially a weakened center. Regional governors began acting like independent rulers. They raised their own armies, collected their own taxes, conducted their own foreign relations. The Taiping Rebellion from 1850 to 1864 shattered Qing control over southern China. A self-proclaimed Christian prophet named Hong Xiuquan raised an army of millions and established a rival state, the Heavenly Kingdom of Great Peace, that controlled vast territories for over a decade. The Qing eventually suppressed the rebellion, but only with the help of regional armies that answered to local commanders, not Beijing. These regional forces never fully returned to central control. Meanwhile, ethnic rebellions exploded across the empire. The Nayan Rebellion in the north, the Pantay Rebellion in Yunnan, the Dungan Revolt in the northwest. Millions died. Entire provinces became ungovernable. By 1900, China was an empire in name only. Real power had devolved to regional strongmen who tolerated Beijing but didn't obey it. Qing institutions, designed for an agrarian empire, couldn't adapt to the modern world. The examination system that had selected talented officials for 1,000 years tested knowledge of Confucian classics, not Western science or modern administration. The bureaucracy was staffed by scholars who could write beautiful poetry but could unbuild railroads or organize modern armies. Reform efforts failed repeatedly. The self-strengthening movement tried to adopt Western technology while preserving Chinese values. It produced some modern arsenals and shipyards, but the underlying institutions remained unchanged. Powerful conservative factions blocked fundamental reform. Limited understanding of Western systems hampered much. Corruption diverted resources from development to personal enrichment. The new policies reforms after 1901 came too late. The dynasty tried to build modern schools, modern armies, modern administration, but the institutional capacity wasn't there. The political will wasn't there. The time wasn't there. By 1910, the Qing government was attempting to create a constitutional monarchy while simultaneously fighting Republican revolutionaries, managing regional warlords, and fending off foreign pressure. It was impossible. The Chinese population stopped believing in the mandate of heaven. The Boxer Rebellion of 1900 was the breaking point. Anti-foreign militants, tacitly supported by the Qing court, attacked Western legations in Beijing. 8 foreign nations invaded China in response. The Empress Dowager fled the capital. Foreign troops looted the Forbidden City. The humiliation was total. The dynasty that claimed the mandate of heaven couldn't protect its own capital. The emperor, who was supposed to be the son of heaven, was a refugee in his own empire. After 1900, educated Chinese increasingly rejected the Qing entirely. Sun Yat-sen's revolutionary movement gained support among students, merchants, overseas, Chinese, even military officers. The message spread. The Qing had lost the mandate. The dynasty had to go. By 1911, when a military revolt broke out in Wuhan, province after province declared independence. Not because the revolutionaries were strong, because no one believed in the Qing anymore. The legitimacy had already collapsed. The revolt just made it official. Check. On February 12, 1912, the last Qing emperor, a 6-year-old boy named Pui, formally abdicated. The empire that had ruled China for 268 years, the civilization that had endured for 4,000 years, fragmented into chaos. What followed wasn't unity. It was the warlord era. Dozens of military commanders carved China into competing territories. Civil war became permanent. Millions died in fighting, famine, and chaos. China wouldn't reunify until 1949, nearly 40 years later, and only then, under a new regime that emerged from the ashes of the old. The Qing followed the pattern exactly. Elite fracturing, regional fragmentation, institutional paralysis, legitimacy collapse, dissolution. 3 great powers. Britain, Russia, China. 3 complete collapses, all following the exact same 6-stage sequence. And here, what should keep you awake at night. The United States is deep into that sequence right now. Let me show you exactly where we are. America's rise was built on shared purpose. The founding, the westward expansion, victory in World War II, the Cold War struggle against communism. For most of American history, citizens disagreed about many things, but agreed on fundamentals. Constitutional democracy, individual liberty, the American dream, e pluribus unum, out of many. One, that shared purpose held America together through civil war, through depression, through social upheaval. The divisions were real, but the center held until it didn't. The American elite has fractured into warring tribes. This isn't normal political disagreement. This is factional warfare where each side views the other as an existential threat. Democrats don't just disagree with Republicans. Each side believes the other is destroying the country. Washington has become a battlefield. Every nomination is a war. Every policy is a weapon. Every institution is captured by one faction and attacked by the other. The Supreme Court has become a political prize. The Justice Department has become a political weapon. The intelligence agencies have become political actors. Nothing is neutral anymore. Everything is factional. Media has split into tribal ecosystems that don't share facts, don't share values, don't share reality. Americans increasingly cannot agree on what is true, let alone what to do about it. Elite consensus has collapsed. The establishment that once governed America, however imperfectly, has shattered into pieces that spend more energy fighting each other than solving problems. As Washington fractures, states are pulling away. Red states and blue states aren't just voting differently. They're governing differently. They're living differently. They're becoming different countries that share a flag. Texas talks about nullifying federal laws. California positions itself as a nation-state that conducts its own foreign policy on climate change. Sheriffs in rural counties refuse to enforce laws passed by state legislatures. Cities declare themselves sanctuaries from federal immigration enforcement. The federal system that was supposed to balance national unity with regional diversity is becoming a mechanism for fragmentation. States aren't cooperating with the federal government. They're competing with it. Regional identities are hardening. The South versus the coasts, rural versus urban, heartland versus metropolis. Americans are sorting themselves geographically into ideological enclaves. The United States is becoming the divided states. This is where America is right now. Deep in stage 4, Congress cannot legislate. The Senate is gridlocked. The House is chaotic. Passing a budget requires a crisis. Passing major legislation requires a miracle. The debt ceiling has become a hostage situation. Government shutdowns have become routine. Appointments are blocked for years. Agencies operate without confirmed leadership. Courts have become political battlegrounds. Every major decision is viewed through partisan lens. Losing parties don't accept adverse rulings as legitimate. They plot to pack courts or ignore decisions. The executive branch lurches between parties that spend their first year undoing everything the previous administration did. No policy is permanent. No reform is stable. No institution is trusted. State governments are often more functional, but they're pulling in different directions. National policy is impossible when states are pursuing contradictory goals. Infrastructure doesn't get built. Immigration doesn't get fixed. Healthcare doesn't get reformed. The debt doesn't get addressed. The system is not because the problems are unsolvable, because the institutions designed to solve them have become arenas for factional combat where solutions are less important than victories. We're entering stage 5 now. Trust in American institutions has collapsed to historic lows. Congress, the presidency, the courts, the media, the medical establishment, the intelligence agencies, law enforcement, pick an institution. A majority of Americans don't trust it. Gallup polling shows confidence in major institutions has fallen to record lows. Only 7% of Americans have confidence in Congress. Faith in the presidency fluctuates wildly based on who holds it. Trust in media has cratered. Americans increasingly don't believe elections are legitimate. Millions believe the 2020 election was stolen. Millions believe democracy is under attack. They can't both be right, but they're both losing faith. Citizens are withdrawing loyalty from the nation and transferring it to their faction. Red America and Blue America are becoming separate countries that happen to share a territory. The legitimacy that holds a nation together, the shared belief that the system is worth preserving, is evaporating. We're not yet at stage 6, but stage 5 is accelerating. We haven't reached stage 6 yet. That's the only good news. Stage 6 is when the system breaks entirely. Secession movements succeed. Constitutional order collapses. Revolution or authoritarian consolidation replaces Republican government. Britain reached stage 6 gradually, losing its empire piece by piece. Russia reached stage 6 suddenly, dissolving in 361 days. China reached stage 6, violently fragmenting into warlord chaos. America's stage 6, if it comes, could take any of these forms. Gradual devolution of power to states until the federal government becomes irrelevant. Sudden constitutional crisis that tears the Union apart. Violent conflict that destroys the current order, or transformation. The pattern isn't destiny, it's a warning. Nations that recognize the pattern can sometimes arrest it, can sometimes reverse it, can sometimes rebuild unity before stage 6 arrives. But that requires acknowledging where we are. Britain didn't believe the empire would collapse. Russia didn't believe the Union would dissolve. China didn't believe the dynasty would fall. Every declining power tells itself the same lies. We're different. Britain had parliamentary democracy. Russia had nuclear weapons. China had 4,000 years of civilization. America has the Constitution. None of it matters if the internal divisions reach critical mass. The other side will compromise. They won't. When factions view each other as existential threats, compromise is betrayal. When winning matters more than governing, governance becomes impossible. The institutions will hold. They won't. Institutions are only as strong as the people who believe in them. When legitimacy collapses, institutions become empty shells. The Soviet Communist Party looked invincible until it wasn't. The Qing bureaucracy looked eternal until it wasn't. We have time. You don't. The Soviet Union went from superpower to dissolution in a single year. The Qing went from apparent stability to abdication in months. Stage 5 to stage 6 happens faster than anyone expects because the foundations have already crumbled. America is telling itself these lies right now. We're exceptional. The other side will moderate. The Constitution will protect us. We have decades to figure this out. The pattern says otherwise. The pattern isn't about ideology. It isn't about left versus right. It isn't about any particular policy. It's about mathematics. When elite fracturing reaches a certain threshold, coordination becomes impossible. When regional fragmentation reaches a certain threshold, unity becomes impossible. When institutional paralysis reaches a certain threshold, governance becomes impossible. When legitimacy collapse reaches a certain threshold, recovery becomes impossible. Each stage feeds the next Elite fracturing accelerates regional fragmentation. Regional fragmentation accelerates institutional paralysis. Institutional paralysis accelerates legitimacy collapse. The pattern is self-reinforcing. Once you're past a certain point, the momentum toward dissolution is almost impossible to reverse. Britain couldn't save the empire by 1945 because the internal divisions had progressed too far. Russia couldn't save the Union by 1991 because the internal divisions had progressed too far. China couldn't save the dynasty by 1911 because the internal divisions had progressed too far. The question for America is whether we've passed that point. The indicators suggest we're close, maybe past. Stage 4 is deep. Stage 5 is accelerating. The warning signs that preceded collapse in Britain, Russia, and China are flashing red across American society. Maybe we'll find a way out. Maybe America can do what three great powers couldn't. Maybe we'll arrest the pattern at stage 4 or 5 and rebuild unity. But the pattern says otherwise. The math says otherwise. And history, which has watched nations tear themselves apart the same way over and over and over, says we're deep into a sequence that ends in dissolution. 3 times it happened before. The pattern says we're next. If America continues on the current trajectory, here's what the pattern predicts. Stage 5 will deepen, trust in institutions will continue collapsing, both sides will increasingly view the other as illegitimate, national identity will fragment further into tribal identities, regional fragmentation will accelerate, states will increasingly act as independent entities, federal authority will erode, the nation will become a loose confederation in practice. Whatever the Constitution says, crisis will trigger stage 6. Economic collapse, military defeat, constitutional crisis, or some shock we can't predict will expose the hollowness of remaining unity. The center that can't hold will finally break. What comes after is uncertain. Peaceful separation, violent conflict, authoritarian consolidation, or some transformation we can't imagine. But the pattern says something is coming. Britain's empire ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. Decades of gradual dissolution that left the nation smaller, but still intact. Russia's union ended suddenly 361 days of accelerating collapse that no one predicted and no one could stop. China's dynasty ended violently, decades of chaos that killed millions and took 2 generations to resolve. America's ending, if it comes, will fit one of these templates. Or maybe a new one. The pattern doesn't specify how. The pattern only says that nations following this sequence arrive at stage 6 and America is at stage 4. Entering stage 5. The clock is running. The pattern isn't prophecy. It's a diagnosis. Nations that recognize the pattern can sometimes reverse it. Britain after the war could have held the empire with enough will and resources. Russia in 1985 could have reformed successfully with different choices. China in 1900 could have modernized quickly enough to survive. They couldn't see clearly. They couldn't act decisively. They couldn't overcome the internal divisions that were tearing them apart. America faces the same choice now. Recognize the pattern and fight it, or deny the pattern and fulfill it. The divisions are real. The paralysis is real. The legitimacy collapse is real. Pretending otherwise doesn't make it go away. It makes it worse. 3 great powers followed this exact sequence. Britain, Russia, China. Each believed they were exceptional. Each believed the rules didn't apply to them. Each was wrong. The pattern doesn't care about American exceptionalism. The pattern is mathematical. Extend the divisions far enough and the nation breaks. That's not ideology. That's physics. We're not at the end yet. Stage 6 hasn't arrived. There's still time, maybe, to reverse course, to rebuild trust, to restore function, to remember that we're one nation, not 2. But the window is closing. The pattern says so. History says so. And every day we spend fighting each other instead of fixing our institutions. The pattern moves one step closer to completion. 3 times before. Same sequence. Same result. The pattern says America is next. If this opened your eyes to where we actually are in the sequence, subscribe. Because when we hit stage 5 and stage 6, you'll want to understand what's happening and why. The answers aren't hiding in the future. They're written in the past, in the fall of Britain, in the collapse of Russia, in the destruction of Qing China, and I'll show you exactly where to look.